Masks. Now see, I could put in any number of quotes from The Mask, but I'm not going to do that. And not just because I thought of it right now. Didn't have any time to look any up.
Troy, for some inexplicable reason, is teaching a sculpture class.
No, she wasn't teaching it. She was just there.
Yeah, that's true. She was doing a terrible job of whatever she was supposed to be doing.
She was there to help them convey their feelings through the clay.
And unfortunately, as someone with an art degree, that doesn't sound out of place for an art class.
And there's this kid who's irritated that his clay doesn't look like the bird that he's envisioning. And Troy gives him a vague, existential, one-sentence piece of advice before walking away without even asking if it makes sense.
Which it doesn't.
But the kid is all grins, so I guess it worked. I was looking forward to seeing his sculpture later.
Troy walks over to Data, who says that the dimensions of his sculpture of a space iPad, or whatever it is, are accurate to within 1.3%. I would like to see the item that he was trying to copy, because it must have been run over by a herd of banthas, based on how deformed his sculpture was.
Gotta bring up Spaceballs, don't ya?
Spaceballs. Did they talk about banthas in there?
No, I was just making a joke. Ha ha ha. Troy shuts Data down, saying he totally missed the point of the exercise and tells him to make something abstract in the form of music. But Data ends up making one of those Beethoven swirl things. And Troy gives him a vague, existential, one-sentence comment before walking away without asking if it even makes sense.
Data is called to the bridge when the Enterprise encounters an unknown comet, which appears to be traveling very slowly through space.
Picard says this comet hasn't ever been mapped before, and nobody knew it was there, so my assumption was that it just appeared out of nowhere, and that was going to be part of the mystery of the episode, but Data says it's been on its current path for 87 million years, so maybe their tracking systems just suck.
And I was impressed that they charted everything that far back and took into account any stray passing objects that could have affected the path of a comet that they didn't even know existed until now, plus comets are always losing mass, so he would have had to have compensated for that. Very impressive, Mr. Data.
Hey man, we saw that one woman chart out stars that weren't going to be formed for 200 billion years or whatever. They know what they're doing. Kind of, except for this comet, which they didn't even know was there.
And while Data analyzes it, a bright light fills the bridge. Data says he believes it was what he calls a sensor echo caused by distortion in the comet's core, so basically he doesn't really explain it.
And he recalibrates the sensors and says it will take 39 hours to sense the comet, which seems like a lot of time.
Beverly and Troy stop by Troy's quarters on their way to Worf's space karate class, where they find a sculpture that they've never seen before. Troy says it doesn't match Riker's style, and I immediately pictured him sculpting a very crude female form or just a big lump of clay with his fingerprints all over it.
I was thinking like a Horgon.
And when they leave, the top part of it glows, which is always a bad sign.
And of course it happens as soon as they walk out the door and some weird Chozo symbol appears on it.
Later, in the sculpture class, Troy is impressed by Data's sculpture of a mask with a sun design on the forehead.
He tells her the image of the mask was exceptionally clear in his mind, which completely surprises Troy since Data is acting way out of his normal operating parameters. But, despite that always having indicated that things are going to go bad, for the past decade she's been working with this robot, she chooses to not do anything about it.
And she asks him if he's the one who left the sculpture she found in her quarters, which had a similar design on it, but he says no.
And she's so close to connecting the dots, less than 10 minutes into this episode, but she just can't make it.
She then finds that a computer terminal is displaying some weird Mesoamerican-looking symbols.
And it turns out the symbols are on the Enterprise screens all over the ship, and Geordi links it back to the sensor sweep of the Comet.
And he says it's reconfiguring their systems.
Riker suggests they start shooting at the Comet to see what happens, which was a great idea.
And Data says he recognizes the symbols, but he doesn't know how. And he tells them what a few of them mean, and says the one depicting the mask he sculpted means death.
Geordi asks if Data thinks he's being affected the same way as the ship's computer, and Data says it's possible, and he'll run a diagnostic, using the possibly compromised system itself, which was asinine. And despite things like this always indicating that things are going to go bad. For the past decade, they've been working with this robot. Geordi and Riker choose to not do anything about it.
They have Worf fire phasers to melt away the outer portion of the comet, which reveals a hidden structure.
It looks like one of those platforms from Sector Z.
And Data can somehow tell that it is over 87 million years old.
Geordi says the structure is transmitting data to the ship's computer, and Data says it's an archive. And when Picard asks how he knows that, Data says he has an intuitive understanding of its function. And despite things like this always indicating that things are going to go bad, for the past decade they've been working with this robot, Picard chooses to not do anything about it. It's actually Data himself who says they should run diagnostics on him, now with the ship's computer, but since they already know that the system has been compromised, that didn't really make much sense either.
And even though they already know that the object is sending information through the sensors that is affecting the ship, Picard tells Worf to keep the scan going for now. I'm sure nothing bad will happen.
I'm surprised Riker didn't say, why don't we just shoot at it again?
Why don't we try to have sex with it? Maybe that'll give us some answers.
I've made a clay sculpture just for this purpose. Later, Riker tells Picard they've confined the computer corruption and it won't spread further. But then he states that the symbols are still floating around in the computer. And based on the second part of his statement, I didn't really believe the first part of his statement.
And Picard is examining the artifacts that have been found all over the ship, another development that should have indicated that they should stop the scan now. And Picard expresses a random, unfounded belief that the artifacts have some kind of ritualistic significance.
Well, Picard's got that archaeology background with Professor What's-His-Face, when they chased him around the galaxy or whatever that episode was about.
And Picard goes even further to say that the object in space seems designed for more than just storing information, despite knowing literally nothing about it.
He finds another, less prominent symbol that's not with the other symbols, and Riker asks him what it means. And instead of going to ask Data, who knows what all of the other symbols mean,
he throws out some more pointless speculation that those artifacts have something to do with movement. While Data is being examined by Geordi, he suddenly says he is experiencing an impulse, but doesn't know what it is. So I assumed he was going to try to kill everybody again.
At the very least, take over the ship.
And he asks Geordi what it feels like when someone is losing their mind. Yet another good sign.
Geordi disconnects him, but Data's insides get all weird and organic, kind of. I don't know, is that what that was supposed to be?
Sure.
And when he turns towards Geordi, he has a symbol on his head and says, Masaka is waking.
In the dumbest, weirdest voice I could imagine.
I think Brent Spiner probably loved this episode to death because he got to do all these weird voices and overact like crazy.
I didn't look, but he probably wrote and directed this episode.
And wrote the novelization of it.
And did the audiobook recording for it.
And made the video game.
And the porn parody.
And the Operation-style board game where you have to not wake Masaka by touching the sides when you're trying to pull the little symbol icons out.
I'm trying to think of something that... no, that doesn't make sense. I don't know. That's probably enough.
That's way more than enough.
Picard heads down to engineering to find Data sitting on the warp core, being really annoying. Picard asks if he is Masaka, and he says no, he is Ehot, and Data is gone.
And all we find out is that Masaka is waking, which he said before in 3 words, but for some reason we have to sit through a whole nother scene saying the same thing.
And when he sees Troy, he calls her Masaka and kneels, saying he is hers. They decide to confine him to quarters, which I will note makes yet another time that Data has caused problems that required him to be isolated from everyone else. And also that they, as usual, took way too long to decide to make that decision.
Geordi determines that the archive is creating different people inside of Data.
In a sense, Data has the android equivalent of multiple personalities.
And Geordi says he thinks Data's positronic brain is being used to recreate those people, the way the replicators were being used to create the artifacts, which doesn't explain how those artifacts ended up in the places that they did.
Geordi says Data is still being transformed, but instead of just shutting down this increasingly dangerous rogue machine that could kill them all, Picard says he'll just go talk to it instead.
While he switches personalities, Data says that he realizes Troy was not Masaka, who he refers to as a queen. And after some more inane dialogue, he switches to another personality who asks for help, saying he is afraid of her.
Picard says since Masaka is so dangerous, they should try to keep her asleep, but one of the Datas says that only Korgano can do that.
The ship suddenly shakes, and Riker says the archive has them in a tractor beam. And Geordi says there's an energy pulse coming through the tractor beam that is overriding their systems.
More than before, apparently.
Data suddenly grabs Picard's wrist, saying, "Don't leave me, and she's going to hurt us all," before reverting to Ihat, who says that Masaka is awake.
Worf goes into 10 forward and finds a giant artifact pillar that inexplicably appears, which is supposedly more disconcerting than a bunch of smaller ones that have already inexplicably appeared.
When Picard examines it, he suggests that the sun image represents Masaka, saying that many cultures use sun imagery to represent royalty, but Data said it was a symbol for death, so I would think that's the route they would be thinking along. But Picard's an archaeologist, so apparently he knows what he's doing.
He's such a good archaeologist, he finds, again, the smaller unknown symbol on the back of the giant pillar.
Geordi says the entire piece wasn't beamed in, the matter was transformed, but they had said that the other artifacts were created by the replicators, so which was it?
Created by the replicator using the ship's existing matter, though, right?
It seems like he's saying that this is different from before.
Picard says they need to blow up the archive, so Geordi and Worf go to configure a torpedo
for a manual launch, and I was hoping that meant that Worf was just going to throw the torpedo out of the shuttle bay, but unfortunately that doesn't happen.
The torpedo isn't working, and when they open it up, it is full of snakes, and instead of just trying again, they run away. And on the bridge, Geordi says 20% of the ship is transformed, which isn't very high, so they could just rig up a torpedo somewhere else. And he says that the communication system is still working. So my question was, why haven't they contacted anyone else about all this weird shit that's going on?
That's a good question, but I was thinking that 20% was high, and that would be interfering with systems even more that are connected through the areas that are now being affected. It'd be severing connections between different parts of the ship, and I don't know.
Well, they were configuring that torpedo right on the floor. It just seemed like they could do that in any room.
Beverly and Geordi say that the archive is recreating matter on the ship into matter from its own culture, which we already knew. Then immediately afterward, Picard says that the archive is recreating matter on the ship into matter from its own culture, which I'm glad they clarified again, because unless we had been watching the episode, how would we know what was happening?
Wait. So, can you clarify how things were being created? And
Picard finally decides that transforming the ship into an alien city is unacceptable, and he asks Geordi for ideas.
Geordi says he's been able to access the archive by traveling back on its own energy beam or whatever, so he can find the transformation program and potentially stop it. But Picard says no, and that the true answer must be with Masaka, and they have to go find and talk to Masaka. And I said, why don't you just let Geordi go do what he's already set up to do, since it sounds like he can do it right now?
And why would Geordi wait to mention that he did something that could probably solve their entire problem? And the way Picard talks about Masaka, he says he wants to access her. I guess his interest in archaeology goes farther than I thought. Picard visits Data again, unfortunately, who is sitting by a small fire, saying it's not warm enough for an old man.
So I assume that the fire suppression systems we've seen on the ship is something that's not working right now.
Data says that Masaka is his daughter, and only Corgano can talk to her.
He then reverts back to Ihat, telling Picard to stop asking questions because he doesn't want to be sacrificed. So Picard offers up himself instead.
And Ihat takes him at his word for some reason, and says Picard needs to build Masaka a temple to get her attention, and he could give Picard the sign he needs.
But while showing him, Ihat suddenly claims that Masaka has found him, and Data reverts back to the old man personality.
Picard asks for the sign again, and Masaka's father says only Corgano can stop her, but he no longer pursues her.
He helps him finish the symbol before Data reverts to the scared child personality,
who says that Masaka sent the others away to die.
Back on the bridge, Geordi has found the transformation program, so I guess he realized that Picard's solution of talking to Masaka didn't make much sense, and decided to search for the program anyway. But Picard doesn't really seem to mind that Geordi blatantly ignored his orders.
And Troy points out that Picard is trusting a personality created by the alien artifact, but Picard says that Ihat risked his life, and Masaka killed him, which only served to show how right Troy was to point that out.
Geordi says he thinks he knows which symbol will create Masaka's temple, and Picard says they'll have to risk it. So they test it, and it creates the temple, but they're standing inside of the area when they test it, which was a really dumb idea.
And they said they cleared that deck first, but I wondered how and why they thought it would only affect that deck. And even if that were the case, would transforming an entire deck not cause even more massive problems with the ship's systems?
Picard finds the mysterious unknown symbol all over the room, paired with Masaka's symbol, and suggests that it's Corgano's symbol, and they are somehow counterparts.
Worf suggests it might represent horns, which mean an animal. They keep making these big assumptions based on literally no information and treat them as definite conclusions. Data gets up and puts on the mask, transforming into Super Data. He goes out into the hall through the unlocked door and easily overpowers the guards.
Picard, Worf, and Troy finally figure out that since Masaka is the sun, Corgano must be the moon.
Two powerful rulers, changing places in a continual cycle.
Picard says if they can find Corgano in the archives, he could make Masaka leave.
The ship shakes, and Masaka appears in the form of Super Data. But how did he get there? Is no one monitoring what's happening? And Masaka refuses to listen to what they have to say, so they leave.
Geordi finds Corgano's symbol in the archive, and Picard immediately tells him to activate the transformation program. And when the others tell him that is risky as hell, he doesn't really have any good counter-arguments.
And he gives them some dumb line of reasoning about Corgano being Masaka's opposite and how he might represent a way to control her. So Geordi inputs the symbol, which creates another mask.
Picard says he'll put it on and imitate Corgano, improvising as he goes, which again, the others say is risky as hell, but he says whatever, and puts on the mask and goes to talk to Masaka.
Troy, strangely, is the voice of reason, pointing out how stupid that is. But Picard says this episode hasn't made sense so far, so
why start now?
When Picard visits Masaka, Masaka says Corgano will never catch her, but Picard says she lives for the chase and that she is tiring. And it was hard for me not to laugh while watching this scene.
Picard eventually convinces Masaka to sleep, which automatically and immediately causes everything to revert back to normal. Even for Data to be standing up, even though he was lounging back in that chair and should have ended up right on his ass.
And it's a good thing the floor materialized at the level they were on and they didn't end up in the ceiling, given that they were on top of a pedestal thing. And Riker immediately contacts Picard and says that everything else is also back to normal. I think literally 2 seconds after it happens is too early to make that conclusion.
And we close with the captain's log saying everything is fine. The end.
Picard says an archaeological team is going to check out the artifact, and he finds a Masaka mask that has not disappeared, but Data tells him it's one that he sculpted out of clay.
He says he had not just the couple personalities we saw, but thousands inside of him.
And now he feels empty, even though a second ago it seemed like he didn't remember anything.
And Picard notes that for a while, Data was more than human. He was an entire civilization.
How deep.
Man, it raised the grade beyond A.
All the way back around to the bottom end again.
Masks. Overall?
The script for this episode felt like they forgot to do a final polish on it and just let it through. The ideas were there and didn't seem too far off from typical TNG, but the dialogue and the way things played out felt really off. Troy being the voice of reason throughout the episode was weird and disorienting, as was her teaching that class at the beginning. As far as Picard goes, I get that they wanted to play up his interest in archaeology, but this was a completely alien culture. Having him try to come to conclusions immediately based on little to no information ironically made it look like he didn't know anything about archaeology. And Picard only seems interested in alien cultures sometimes. They run into alien stuff all the time, but usually he doesn't seem overly interested in that stuff. Plus, having an interest in archaeology doesn't automatically make you better at figuring out a culture you've never encountered before.
Speak for yourself.
Nor does it suggest that he would automatically be interested in learning about that culture. It's a character trait that only seems to pop up when the writers specifically want to play it up. In real life, he would probably be interested in archaeology regarding specific cultures or specific aspects of archaeology, but they just lump everything together. Brent Spiner was incredibly annoying, which he usually is when he's not playing Data or lore.
I don't know, I think for lore, he gets annoying too. That time when he showed up and was like, the Soong brothers will take you out. For sure that was a quote.
I hope they fired whoever's idea it was to have him act the way he did as Ehot.
Well, they can't fire Brent Spiner.
Well, they should have. They should have written an episode where he got disassembled and thrown into the sun.
Or maybe just disassembled and rebuilt, and that's their excuse to use a different actor.
And no one else really had anything to do other than Geordi doing typical Geordi stuff. The way the problem was resolved was extremely uninteresting, especially since it mostly amounted to Picard making those dumb conclusions and blindly pushing forward with them. And the personalities from the other culture weren't interesting either, partially because we didn't actually learn anything about them. We didn't learn anything about the archive or why anything was happening, and there's no particular reason to care other than it was affecting the Enterprise.
Well, the alien culture was probably trying to build their entire civilization in Sector Z when Andros attacked with those missiles.
Oh, I forgot. Yeah, everything was explained in a different media. If this was the first episode of TNG that someone watched, I can't imagine that they would have actually sat all the way through it, because there's no reason to care about what happens to any of these characters because none of them matter in this episode, other than Picard randomly figuring things out, and I guess Data being a vessel for other characters that we don't know anything about. I think that's the biggest problem with the episode, even higher than how stupid Brent Spiner and Patrick Stewart looked at the end with those masks on. I shouldn't be laughing at what should be the scene with the highest tension. I gave this episode an F+, the plus because at least they had some kind of ideas there. They just needed some actual writing behind them to make them work.
Okay. I originally had an F, but that last point you made is going to bring me up to an F+ too. How were things being created on the ship?
I was hoping they would at some point say something about it affecting a person, a person being transformed into something else, and not in the way the Data was.
Well, they specifically said our DNA is also being altered. So I thought they would show people turning into other people.
Yeah, I initially was thinking that the DNA was coming from plants they had on the ship or something, but I guess other than like the Arboretum, we don't really see plants.
This was a pretty dumb episode. The subject matter was unique, but the execution was really lacking, and that ending was egregious. I thought it was odd that nobody seemed more concerned that the ship's technology had been easily infiltrated. That has happened before, and they all freak out. But they don't in this case because, it's more passive, because it doesn't automatically start to shut down life support? But I feel like they've encountered other passive viruses like that, and they still took immediate action. And once the archive started shooting tractor beams or whatever, that's when they said, oh damn, we should probably do something. And nobody was watching Data in his room throughout the entire thing. So anything could have been happening in there. They had 2 guys waiting outside of his room, but it would have been smarter to be actively monitoring the rogue robot instead of waiting for him to, bust out of his room and knock out the people who were supposed to be standing guard.
And when they said they were scanning the artifact and they were unable to break that connection, couldn't they have just flown away?
Stop making all the points I'm about to make. At any point before that, when things were already starting to go off the rails, they could have left the Comet, but they chose to stay right next to it. And when the artifacts started appearing in random places and nobody knew what they were or where they came from, why did they just leave them? They could be emitting some weird radiation or mind control waves, but people were just like, oh, that's neat. Let's just let it sit there.
The extent of their investigation of the artifacts was just Picard looking at him saying, this is kind of cool.
Why nobody took any action immediately when Data started acting abnormally was beyond me. And why they didn't just shut him down when he was outright acting like different people and they knew that his positronic whatchamacallits were being rewritten. Why just shut him down? Turn him off. Picard was super out of character, taking all these crazy-ass risks for no real reason. Even when other characters around him were saying, isn't that a crazy-ass risk you're taking for no real reason? And he just shrugged it off and said, I'll improvise. This episode annoyed me.
I agree.
I would rather watch The Mask than have to sit through this episode again.
At least it was better than Son of the Mask.
I didn't say Son of the Mask, and I didn't say that cartoon.
I never saw the cartoon, so maybe, I don't want to give judgment on that. Was that one of the shows that was made by the Jumanji and Men in Black people?
It looked more normal, so I don't know. I know Rob Paulson was the voice of The Mask.
Oh, okay. Well, okay, that sounds terrible then. Oh, man. So at least it wasn't as bad as that.
Super Data.